Everyone, this video looks at some of the historical underpinnings and social assumptions that in some ways underpin our current high levels of intimate partner violence in our society. From the late 1700s through the 1800s and really into parts of the 20th century, there was a strong ideology in Western European cultures that men belonged in the so-called public sphere and women belonged in the separate private sphere. Women's place was in the home. So that meant that ideally they would not work for money outside the home, that they should spend their time parenting their children and looking after their home, and therefore they needed little or no education, only enough to help them bring up their children appropriately. On the other hand, this ideology said that men's place was in the public sphere, that is, in the world outside the home, having more and higher education, in paid work, in economic endeavours, in politics, government, basically anything that was outside the home. And interestingly, you'll have noticed that that meant most of the prestigious and powerful occupations were actually apportioned to men. At the same time, though, they were expected to do less direct parenting and little or no home duties, so may have a much lesser link with their children. This, of course, was a primarily ideological position. While middle and upper class white Westerners were able to live this lifestyle, many working class women, many people of colour in many countries were actually expected to work outside the home, particularly if they were women. So they were other people's servants, they worked in factories, they worked in fields, etc. And they, however, this idea that they ought not to be working outside the home heavily influenced how women could access the public sphere. For example, leading to them having substantially lower wages, being exposed to harassment in ways that men were not. So it also led to particular series of disadvantages for women and female identified persons. There were substantial economic disadvantages. This meant that women had little choice but to make do, to marry, and to put up with whatever happened within that marriage, because there was no paid occupation often open to them. They had little or no access to abortion, contraception, and family planning. And in fact, in many countries, all of those things were illegal well into the 20th century. As you know, here in Queensland, until the 21st century for abortion, women who were relatively unable to access public life in the form of education, which again would allow them to move more independently in the world, work, business activities, and of course political rights. They did have responsibility for the home and family, but very little power and few rights over property or even parenting decisions. That is, they were given the responsibility to raise children, but if their husbands or male partners decided that something should happen differently, the man's idea was what would happen. The woman had little or no control over it, or even over where she was to live or what she was to wear, etc. There were very few historical rights over her own life, her body, or her safety. So certainly in the later 18th and early 19th centuries, there was very little safety for women from male violence in the home. That was considered a private matter. There was a lack of full legal subjectivity and citizenship for women, in that while they were technically citizens, they didn't have the vote, and if they were married, they were considered as legal non-persons under that law of coverture that I've discussed elsewhere. Many caring activities were coded as feminine, which led to obligations to care for children, the ill, the aged, etc. And this, at the same time, did have some adverse effects on men who had carer roles, and it had substantial economic effects on what are now known as pink collar jobs, such as teaching, nursing, etc., that are often seen as women's work until late into the 20th century. Some people argue that this led to a culture of women, that is, that women almost effectively had a separate culture from men in England in the 17 and 1800s. However, everyone, of course, was still part of the wider culture, and women who acted in the outside the private sphere were substantially disadvantaged, which left them very vulnerable to the power and potential violence of men in the private sphere. There are ongoing effects of this ideology, including a lack of current representation in government. You can see the percentages of women in various Australian parliaments. That was as at 2019. That women were shut out of many professions until approximately the mid-20th century, either first legally, as in the persons cases that I took you through in an earlier module, or alternatively through social pressure and social stigma in taking on certain types of roles. Women are substantially still underrepresented in higher levels of business. For example, there are actually more men called David, John or Peter who run ASX 200 companies than there are women of any name who run those companies. And women still do substantially more housework and caring responsibilities and caring work than men. And I've linked a YouTube video if you're interested that you can watch on that. So again, this leaves women comparatively vulnerable for some women to violence, in that they rely upon not only their partner to support them financially, but also that they have a historical view of the role of men and women in the family. There are also differing standards for parenting in criminal law and family law matters often seen, which can lead to differential approaches to violence in the home. And there's a lack of legal and social recognition of the economic value of private harms, such as domestic violence, and of the work in the home, which is usually unpaid and undervalued, leaving women in a more economically tenuous position in many situations.